Welcome back. In this set of video lectures, I'm going to be talking through some ideas from René Descartes, in particular from his famous book, The Meditations. But before we get into the text of the Meditations, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Descartes, the human being. Descartes was born in France, educated at La Flèche, which was a famous Jesuit school at the time, that is a Catholic school. The Jesuits were a Catholic order that was particularly committed to learning of scientific and philosophical kinds. So they were a particularly a branch of the Catholic Church of the those who had devoted themselves to a monastic lifestyle, that is, monks and nuns, that had devoted themselves to or committed themselves to acquiring knowledge. Not all monastic sects had the same degree of commitment to learning and to knowledge, but the Jesuits did have that commitment. So that's where Descartes got his education, and he later said it was probably the best kind of education available at the time, but he also said that in the context of saying that he was surprised at how little people actually could say they confidently knew at the time. So his impression was that there was a lot of disagreement, debate, uncertainty, even about fundamental issues, and he wanted to resolve some of those fundamental issues in his own work. I'm drawing there on some of his autobiographical remarks in his book, The Discourse on Method, which was published in 1837, 4 years before the Meditations were published. And that's an easy text to read if you're interested. It's easy to find that text online, The Discourse on Method, which gives some more details about Descartes' own biography in his own words. It's his own sort of story of his life. Descartes made important contributions to math and science, including introducing the idea of what are today called Cartesian coordinates. You remember that y-axis and x-axis, and plotting points somewhere between the y-axis and the x-axis. What that allows people to do, basically, is to translate between geometry and algebra. Geometry is a medium in which we have visual representations of figures and distances and so on, whereas algebra is working with algorithms or working with formulae, and it's a bit it can be cumbersome translating back and forth between those two mediums, and the Cartesian coordinate system allows for an easy translation between those. I'm sure there are many other things that it's useful for, but that's one of the things. It's one of the ways. That's one of the ways that it was useful and was attractive for people as a device at the time. We're sort of moving into a science that needs to be able to rely on algebra more and more complicated kinds of physics, more complicated kinds of quantitative representations of systems that are under study, and so that's a very useful thing to have. The Greeks, primarily, their math was primarily geometrical, but in modern philosophy, or modern science, I should say, and modern mathematics, things become increasingly algebraic. And then this is an important development, too, on the way to the calculus, which is developed shortly after Descartes by Newton and by Leibniz. Descartes also made contributions to physics, to optics, that is the theory of light and vision. Cartesian physics, Descartes' physics is a variation, I shouldn't just say variation, but an alternative to Aristotle's physics. And Descartes' physics was had influential advocates at his time and shortly after, and there was even a kind of running debate between Cartesian physicists and Newtonian physicists. Isaac Newton, the famous founder of at least one of the most influential ways of thinking about physics, with Newton's laws of motion and so on. the three laws of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and so on. So Newton is sort of the great genius of classical physics, who kind of lays out everything in a system at his time in the late 1600s. But before there was Newton, there was Descartes, and Descartes had attempted something similar with his physics, a kind of universal physics, or a physics that would account for all bodies and bodies in motion, and relate things like weight and speed and distance and things like that. Descartes also made some contributions to what we might today call medicine or physiology. He had a theory of the heart of organisms as a furnace, something that heated the body. And this was in contrast with another theorist, Harvey, who theorized the heart as a pump. Today, we think the heart is much more a pump than a furnace. So we think Descartes was wrong about this. But his theory was one of the competing theories at the time about what the heart does physiologically. So as I've been describing, Descartes made these contributions to the sciences that were recognized by all scientifically minded people in Europe, or I should say all other researchers in Europe. He was in correspondence with other researchers in Europe. He was doing his own experiments and in communication with other people about these things. He had an early book that had laid out a kind of universal system of physics, or natural philosophy, as it was called at the time, for understanding the motions of the planets and motions on Earth, called Le Monde, and also included some medicine and physiology as well. But he decided not to publish this after he had heard about Galileo's persecution. So Galileo at this time is doing his own researches, and you may know the famous story that Galileo had published some researches that basically he took to be very strong evidence that the Copernican system of astronomy, that is the system that holds that the sun is the center of the solar system, and that the center of the known universe, one might say, and that the Earth and the other planets rotate around the sun. This was a new theory. The older theory, the theory that the Catholic Church held as the official theory, was a theory that was held by a lot of the ancient Greeks, that the Earth is the center of the known universe, and that all of the other planets and the sun and all the stars circle around the Earth. So the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe, or the known universe, was the official and established position as of the 1550s, 1560s, 70s, and so on. And Descartes learned that Galileo, who had defended the new alternative theory from Copernicus, that the sun is the center of the known universe, had been persecuted by the Catholic Church. Basically, he was forced to recant, or else he would have been jailed and probably tortured. He was basically required to issue a public statement that he did not believe that the sun was the center of the universe, and he was put on house arrest, so he couldn't leave the place where he lived and worked for many years. The Catholic Church, again, was worried about this idea, this new scientific idea, being very disruptive to the overall worldview of the time. And so they persecuted scientists who held that unpopular, or I should say that view that they believed to be dangerous. Descartes, for much of his life, had a job with the French military. He wasn't actually a soldier. I mean, he did witness or see some battles, but not as a fighting member of the military, but rather he was more involved in what you might call reconnaissance or research. Just generally, he was a smart person that could solve problems, and the French military liked to put him on different projects. And he traveled the world in connection with this position. So he got to see many different places and kind of styles of life of people, and he reports on that in his autobiography as well, The Discourse on Method. He says he saw that there were lots of different opinions and ways of living life in different parts of the world, and this further convinced him that basically nobody really yet knows what the best way to live is, or the best way to think and believe about things. So he was impressed both from his early education and the controversies among the school, you could say schoolmasters, the controversies among his teachers, but also he was convinced by his travels around the world that that nobody has a really firm grasp on what it is that we should believe and how we should live. That people don't have knowledge that could be called certain. And he, perhaps surprisingly, wanted to find such knowledge, wanted to achieve such knowledge. And so that was actually his main aim in philosophy. One of his main aims, I should say, was to provide a more secure foundation for knowledge than anything that had been achieved thus far. And another kind of funny biographical point about Descartes is that he didn't like to wake up before noon. So I like to think of this when parents are criticizing their kids for waking up late, that, hey, Descartes was a pretty great scientist and philosopher, and he didn't wake up before noon most of the time. At one point in his life, he had a dream that it was his destiny to establish a new foundation for the sciences. He actually dreamed that God spoke to him and said, it's your destiny to establish a new foundation for the sciences. In the book Discourse on Method, which is really one of 4 parts in a larger book, which also includes some reports from his scientific and mathematical research. In the Discourse on Method, he describes this new foundation for the sciences. It's basically his method, or his foundational set of beliefs that provide the basis, he says, for all the rest of what he was able to discover. And so he thinks that this is the way everybody should think. He's sort of giving a lesson in what people should believe most fundamentally, in order to get things right and in order to go on to discover things about the world. In the Meditations, he's going to basically make that argument in more detail. He's going to lay out this fundamental set of beliefs that he thinks are the starting place should be the starting place for everybody. And if we think this way, we're going to be able to do better science, we're going to get religion right, we're going to understand our place in the universe, and this is the way to, these are the, this is the starting point for anyone who wants to really know things for certain, rather than just kind of pass through the various opinions that may be correct or incorrect that different people have had.